The Alberta government has tabled legislation with Bill 24, which they say will ensure safe and caring schools for all vulnerable students, including sexual and gender minority students. Now, the problem some have with the bill is that it leaves parents out of the loop. Joining me now via Skype is former teacher and blogger Theresa Ng with Informed Albertans. Welcome to the program, Theresa.
Thank you.
So GSA clubs are highly touted as anti-bullying clubs and peer support groups. So people are asking, what is the big deal? Do we really know what takes place at these clubs, Theresa?
Yeah, so on its surface, when we hear the news reports, they like to talk a lot about gay-straight alliances being merely peer support groups. But the reality is, when you go, for example, in the Alberta Teachers Association, they have a manual for GSAs, for teachers, and it talks about 4 different types of GSAs. Now, the first couple of types more have to do with the counseling and the peer support and the safe spaces, which is what people normally conceptualize GSAs to be. But the other 2 types have to do with, they're called clubs for educational and social change. And it talks about political activism, and it talks about bringing school-wide presentations and promoting inclusive curriculum and that kind of thing. And I think that that's where most people have more of the issue, is with this idea of transforming schools really into this place where kids are being enlisted into more activist type of activities, and then imposing that then on other people in the school population who may have very different and diverse views about sexuality and identity and that kind of thing.
So I understand that Bill 24 makes it illegal for teachers to inform parents that their child has joined a GSA. And this is really to protect the kids from their own parents who could possibly object to their child and their sexuality issues. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. So that's the entire, that's the justification, that's the premise of why the government is saying that we need this protection for kids. But if you really think that through, it doesn't really make logical sense, because first of all, gay-straight alliances are not just intended for sexual gender minority children. They're actually, part of the purpose is to bring together sexual gender minority children with kids who are allies. They're not sexual gender minority identities themselves. And so really simply by attending a GSA, you're not actually disclosing anything about your personal identity or orientation. The other issue is that we have this idea that the government is founding all of this justification on, that somehow parents can't be trusted with their own children. And I think that, drivers, for example, when we have poor drivers on the road, we would never suggest to, in order to keep everybody safe, we have to take everybody's keys away. Nobody's allowed to drive because there's some bad drivers. The reality is that yes, there are some situations where parents may cause, there may be challenges within the family. If those challenges are severe enough, like abuse, that's already covered in legislation. When I was a teacher in the public system, if we had any suspicion of any sort of abuse, we were legally obligated to make that call to social services. And if we failed to do so, we would actually be charged and fined for not making that call. And in terms of the other families that may need some time to work through these issues, what I explain to people is that we need to put the emphasis on building bridges, not walls. So for example, a lot of people the counter argument is, well, if you had a good relationship with between you and your child would tell you. But any parent, I have 3 kids, I know that children don't necessarily tell their parents everything, not because the parent is a bad parent, but just because kids are kids and they don't necessarily, sometimes in their minds, they may have an idea, they may be concerned or scared or whatever, but that doesn't mean that we should build a wall between the parents and the child. That means that we should help them to build a bridge. Because really, if that child is having difficulty with communication and we isolate them, we're not actually setting them up for any sort of long-term success. What we're doing is we're actually, to their detriment, isolating them very short-sighted in the school environment. And then what happens when they're out of that grade or out of that school and they still don't have the tools to communicate with their own families who are with them for their entire lives? So I think a lot of families are very concerned, first of all, with the premise to say we can't trust anybody just because of a few people who when actually giving them tools, mediation, communication would actually set them up for longer term health and success.
Now, you say the Canadian Charter of Rights and the Family Law Act both make it clear that parents have the legal right to direct and be fully informed about all aspects of their children's education?
Mm-hmm. Well, and actually, I wanted to refer people. There's an excellent document by the Justice Centre for Constitutional Freedoms, and it talks about how Alberta's Bill 24 actually violates of charter freedoms. So I foresee that, I'm not a lawyer, but based on what I've read from the Justice Centre, that there are tremendous problems with this bill, if passed into law, that violate many charter freedoms and parental rights.
Now, is it true that Bill 24 amendments also extend to school-wide activities, including assemblies, plays, and performances?
Yes, they do. So basically, the amendments in Bill 24, that's currently the case even under what used to be called Bill 10 when it passed into law in March of 2015. Already this legal rights given to students already extended beyond just clubs into school-wide activities. What Bill 24 does is it makes it even stronger, and it says that when a student comes to a principal with either requesting a club, they call it a voluntary student organization, or requesting an activity, an associated activity, the principal must immediately grant permission. And that word immediately has now been added through is proposed to be added through Bill 24. So really what it does is, even beyond disempowering parents, it's also undermining principals, because basically they are faced with a choice to either comply with a student's demand when it comes to activities or these groups, or face legal repercussions for not following that. And that's very dangerous, because I think that principals, if we trust principals to be responsive to their local needs, we need to trust their discretion, and we need to trust their authority to understand their school climate. This has particular implications for faith-based schools. So basically this Bill 24, if it's passed, is consolidating the power in the hands of the education minister to simply, it's a fake choice, basically saying you have a choice, but it must be this one.
Well, and the education minister will be given the power to rewrite school board policies. Are parents aware of this?
Yeah, so unfortunately, what the media has latched onto with Bill 24 is this whole rhetoric about outing children. And what they fail to expose and explain to the public, that the amendments to the School Act that would happen through Bill 24 go far beyond just that one issue, to the point that I'll just read to you. They would amend Section 45.1 of the School Act to say that the minister may, by order, do one or both of the following: establish a policy or code of conduct for, or add to, or replace a part of a policy or code of conduct of a board, or impose any additional terms or conditions the minister considers appropriate. So what this does is it undermines the very essence, to me, of democracy. We democratically elect these school boards to, again, be responsive to local needs and students and families. And then what Bill 24 would do is allow the education minister to have this kind of sweeping new authority to just go in, and if in his opinion this doesn't meet his standard, to just go in and either change it or to impose sanctions. For example, loss of, I think one of the ones that is mentioned in here is loss of funding or loss of accreditation. And so this puts faith-based, particularly targets faith-based schools who may want to address bullying and safe and caring schools through a faith lens. And what this says is, well, if you're not doing it exactly how we, the government, deem acceptable, then we can just change it or basically shut you down, right?
That gives that one person a lot of power, you know, which is pretty scary, isn't it? Now, the Alberta curriculum is currently going through a rewrite. Are Albertans informed as to who the people are who are doing this rewrite?
So that's a good question. That's separate from Bill 24, but it's tied in with this whole concept of understanding who's holding the reins, who's holding the authority here. As of yet, even though there's been repeated requests of the Minister of Education to disclose who is at the helm of those curriculum changes, no information has been provided as of yet.
So who should be making educational choices for our children, especially when it comes to very sensitive subject matter such as morality, sexuality, and faith?
Well, that's a really good question. And I think in a free, democratic society, really, you need to leave those kinds of decisions to families and to parents. And we just celebrated Remembrance Day on the weekend. And the entire concept of parental rights in education, the UN Declaration of Human Rights that talks about parents being the primary educators and caregivers of their children, arose from that context. And so I think that tells us something about how important it is in a free society for families to maintain that authority over their own value system and over their own children. Because what we have here, I don't know if the MLAs and the media, the government even understand that once they pass a law that gives the government more power, that they will also be subject to that power when, down the road. So it may be fine and good when the education minister and the government is ideologically aligned with their views. But what happens if we get a new education minister or a new government who may not be ideologically aligned with them, right? It actually erodes everybody's freedom when you take away that right.
So what should concerned parents do then, Theresa, to make their voices heard?
So that's a great question. One of the things that has really hit home for me over the last 2 years as I've been advocating about these issues is that people in general need to get more involved in democracy. So if we expect our government to represent us, then we actually need to make sure that our voice is out there in the public sphere. Otherwise, they're not hearing from us. So I would suggest contacting your MLA, sending them a message, letting them know that you're deeply concerned about how this bill, if it's passed into law, actually undermines the authority of parents, of principals, of teachers, and of democratically elected school boards to really be responsive to the needs of children in their schools. We really need to understand that when you take away authority and power from any parent and concentrate it in the hands of the government, you're actually eroding everybody's freedom in the end. And the other thing to do is to inform other people. So I find the biggest obstacle is that so few people actually know what's happening. And I highly recommend, I have my own blog, Informed Albertans. Parents for Choice in Education has so many resources, and it's at parentchoice.ca for people to really equip themselves. So I truly believe like knowledge is power. And when you understand what's happening, then you can make better decisions. And then you can also equip other people, spread the word, right? Because what people are being fed through the kind of mainstream media rhetoric is not the entire story. They're hyper-focusing on one aspect and really obscuring the full implications of what this bill would do, especially when it comes to, really imposing whatever view of sexuality and value system the government happens to have onto our children who are impressionable, who are a captive audience in schools. And in GSAs, it doesn't take very long on the Gay Straight Alliance Network website to understand the view of sexuality as one that it talks about the gender unicorn. It talks about that that gender and sexuality are completely fluid, that they exist on a spectrum of infinite possibilities, talking about that kids can change their gender to any time that they want, to many different, they list a whole bunch of identities on the website. And they even go so far as to say on the definitions page that the term biological male and female is actually inaccurate and defamatory. Wow. Meaning that this isn't just about protecting LGBTQ kids. This is actually about imposing a very specific view about sexuality on everybody, right?
We live in interesting times, don't we? Theresa Ng, former teacher and blogger of Informed Albertans, thanks so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you.